Got 20 seconds. Come on, Amanda, go.
Keep moving, keep moving, keep moving. Good. Get those knees up. Explode. Good. Explode. Let's go. Up.
Rock forward. Let's go. One more. Go.
You are listening to the Fight Strength Podcast with your hosts, Phil Daru and Jason Burgos.
What is up, fitness and fight fans, and welcome back for episode 13 of the Fight Strength Podcast. I am Jason Burgos, editor and contributor for MMAsucker.com, and with me is my co-host extraordinaire, the strength and conditioning grandmaster of American Top Team, Phil Daru. Phil, good morning. How are you?
Man, the intros keep getting better and better. I like what you're bringing out to me right now.
You like grandmaster? You feel like a dangerous, skilled, wise individual with that name?
I feel like a superhero.
Oh,
a superhero. You like that?
I like. Who is your favorite superhero?
Who's my favorite right now?
Yeah,
it goes back and forth, man. It goes back and forth. Like, I like Iron Man, but I'm also obviously I like the Hulk. You know what I'm saying? So it goes back and forth. But right now, I gotta say that I'm feeling Batman right now for some reason.
Really? Any reason why?
It's just the darkness of him, right? And he's real quiet, but he's got that deep voice. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I kind of feel like I'm him at some points. You know what I mean? Because of my voice.
I mean, it makes sense. He's well prepared. He's always seeing all the angles. He's working very hard all the time. He's playboy, billionaire. Then he's a hero. Now he's like you. He gets very little sleep.
There it is.
Well, before we move on to our first segment, I have to mention that our show can be listened to on iTunes, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, Google Play Music, and YouTube. Please give us a listen and a rating, a comment. If you like the show, please share it. Also, just a big thank you to those of you who do listen weekly and have helped to grow our podcast every week. We really appreciate your support. We aim to make the show better every time for you guys and gals. Today we're going to have on strength and conditioning coach Tony Ricci, a fellow New Yorker, which I dig a lot. He teaches tons of other MMA fighters, one of them being Chris Weidman. Real lucky to have him on today. But now, on to our Ask Daru segment, which is a usual traditional part of the show. It's sponsored by Daru Strong Training Systems. If you want to live a healthier and stronger life, just like a pro athlete, you need to start using these systems. Phil, could you explain, for people listening, how they can find out and use these systems, even if they don't live in the Florida area?
Yeah, you can check out my online programming. Go to darustrong.com. We also have, obviously, templates that I'll be writing up. It's in the works right now, so stay tuned. Within the next couple of months, I'll be having templates for all activity levels, all sports, and all general fitness levels. So be on the lookout for that. Also, I'll be doing more seminars throughout the year and, just trying to keep grinding, So if you have any questions or anything like that, or concerns, go ahead and go to my email, phil@darustrong.com, and I'll answer any of your questions there.
And could you also mention, for the people that do follow Phil on Facebook or Instagram or on Twitter, but if you don't, can you tell them about the 21-day
Sure.
that you're working on?
Yeah, so right now, as pretty much every day, I make sure that I have something that I do that qualifies me to pretty much progress in my further goals. So I'm going to give out a 21-day challenge to everyone who wants to participate in this everyday activity where you're going to be doing something that will progress you to get to your goal. And within these 21 days, depending if you do it correctly, you will develop the habit of everyday use to get you to that progressive state, to get you to that success that you're looking for. So for me personally, I'm going to get up every day and I'm going to meditate for 5 minutes. And it doesn't have to be big, but it's going to help me clear out my mind and set up my schedule. And even if I have to get up 10 to 20 minutes earlier, it's not a big deal for me because I know that it'll set up my entire day and to get me further on in my future.
I mean, and I dig the idea. It's it's not hard to do, but people are so busy in their daily schedule and things to do. Just getting out there and doing it, and once you get into that rhythm, I mean, it becomes a lot easier than people probably think at the beginning.
Yep. So I would say state what you're going to be doing. Do it every day. Post it up on social media. Hashtag Daru Strong Challenge, and let's get these habits in order, man. You know what I'm saying? Let's make it happen.
All right. Now, I mean, you've already motivating people for the 21-day challenge. Do you happen to have any motivational words for the masses today to further even push them to do the 21-day challenge and realize that they can do it just like Phil Daru can?
Yeah, check this out. So here's my quote of the day, and this could be carried on throughout your entire life, but here goes. Take a look at your life and the direction it's going, and if you're unsure about the future, chances are you're on the wrong path. So basically stating, if you feel like you have no future, you feel like you're going nowhere, you're doing monotonous things or doing a job that you're not clearly happy to do, take a look at what you're doing in the current state and let's change it so you can be happy in the future.
Yeah, I concur completely. I co-sign on that totally. Now, for the Ask Daru segment, a little in-house questioning. Our first question is from Jason Burgos in New York. What? That's so strange. What did he has my name?
This would be a good one.
All right. Now, Michael Johnson recently announced at a UFC Q&A that he may be planning a move to 145 pounds. Could you explain how much of a change to an athlete's training habits would come from a complete division change of 10 pounds like that? Is it even more time dedicated to weight cutting and all that kind of stuff? Could you break it down since you have so many athletes that have to prepare for things like this?
Yeah, so, it really just depends, of course, on the fighter and the circumstances. Now, if we're talking Michael Johnson, he wasn't necessarily a big 55er, so moving to a natural weight class for him, like 145, will probably be an easy transition. Now, the thing is, if a fighter is bigger, walks around fairly lean year-round, and has to cut tremendous amounts of weight to make the weight, then issues may arise like muscle atrophy and strength decrease, which leads to decreases in explosiveness and overall speed, so we don't want that. Your aerobic capacity may still be there, but in some cases that may get hindered as well. So this is why I'm never fully for dropping down a weight class unless the fighter actually has enough extra weight to drop. So you can make a case for him to drop the weight and disperse to make 145. Now, I know his strength coach. We know his strength coach. He's been on the show recently, Corey Peacock.
Yep.
And I honestly believe if he's with Corey, he can understand the mechanisms that he needs to put together and the programs he needs to put together to get him down to 145 safely and easily and actually not decrease performance and actually increase his performance due to not having any extra weight that he has to carry. In general, it's a good way to go. For most, it may not be.
Now, do you feel like it's weird? Like Michael Johnson's yeah, you mentioned that he's a smaller 55, but he's almost like a skinny 55, trying to cut that extra 10 pounds, which for, people that don't follow the sport enough probably think, oh, it's 10 pounds, what's the big deal? But it's actually a lot. It's a big deal. Yeah. I feel like it hurts him because since he's not a muscular kind of 55, he's not like a, Chad Mendes at 45, you maybe want to go down. Do you think it'll hurt him like his ability to maybe stop takedowns or his cardio? In your opinion, do you feel like it's a good move for him? Is it a dicey move? Could it go either way? Is it a right fit? Is it a bad fit?
To be honest, he's not a big 155er, so I don't see it being an issue. Like I said, if he was up there with like George Masvidal or like a Cowboy Cerrone, then I'd be like, damn, okay, because these guys had to move up to 170 because they were that big. You know what I mean? So if he was anywhere bigger than what he is now, it could play an issue. But like I said, he has extra amount of weight that he could lose and still be optimal with his performance, with his movement qualities, with his strength increases. So like I said, it just depends on the program that they put him on, plus his diet. And if he's eating clean and he's walking around, let's say 10 to 12 pounds, 15 pounds max from fight weight, then it shouldn't be a problem for him to get down to 45. Now, if he's walking around at, like, let's say, I was 172 to 170.
Right.
It can be an easy cut, but if he's up there in the 180s, 185, now we're really talking some big drastic changes that he has to make in his diet, in his aerobic training, so it is a change. But like I said, I don't know him enough to, go about stating what he's going to be doing. But I can tell you this, that yes, it does play a role when somebody does cut 10 more pounds from their original weight class. And it can, mess up performance in general if you're not fully capable of getting the weight down in time and have a good enough diet to withstand your training sessions.
Now, when you say if it was a 170, 172, you mean 170 or 172 away from 55?
No, if he's walking around at 172, 170,
yeah,
we're talking about, in fight camp about 8 weeks out.
Okay.
We're going there, then he should be okay. I'd primarily like to see him around, obviously, 60, 65.
Yeah.
So, but that's not the case in a lot of ways, So if he's actually walking around, he should be. I think he's walking around right now at 175. But I don't want to put, I don't want to make any statements like I know, But he looks about 170, 175, and if so, then we need to get him down. You would need to get him down to slowly get him down to 68 before fight camp starts, about 8 to 10 weeks out, and then let him kind of coast and cruise at 168. And then get him down to about 62, 60, around 6 weeks out. And about a week out, he should be close to 57 to 55 and cut the rest water there.
So in your expert opinion, doing this for many years, you don't want to be any more, walking around 6 weeks or more out, anywhere from 15 to 20 pounds away from the way you're supposed to be. Once you're out of that range, you're putting yourself in danger. And if, could you explain for me, even your experience of having to deal fighters, when you're out of that range and you're really pushing, how much extra hard work and how much does it take away from your other training habits and working in certain disciplines, that extra unneeded weight can have an effect on a guy as he gets closer to a fight or a girl?
It can definitely have an effect because they're primarily thinking about their weight. And it doesn't really start to hit them until about 3 to 4 weeks out, where they're like, damn, I really got to get this weight off. It's going to be tough. And it plays a role in their mentality of going about training. They do a little bit more. They're training a little bit harder, thinking they got to get the weight off. And then they end up overtraining and being fatigued. And then the skill work, makes a decrease. So at the same time, you have to make sure that they are properly dieting and getting down each and every week adequately, safely, to keep on with the progression of the program. Now, it does play a role if somebody's, a little bit more heavier, let's say a week out, then we have to alter everything, and everything kind of correlates and revolves around the weight cut, which shouldn't be. It shouldn't be like that. They should be, really honing in on what they got to do for the fight, game planning, working on mobility work and just drilling. And if, primarily the true goal right there come fight week is to get the weight down, then now they're not really focusing on the fight itself.
Yeah. All right. I mean, if for everybody listening, you looking for nutrition tips, I mean, me and Phil both have questions for our guest, Tony Ricci, a little later on the Nutrition Show. Please stick around if you want some more info. Now, for our next question, also from me, for an MMA fighter in camp, they can have a lot of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak, having several coaches specializing in certain elements, the wrestling coach, jiu-jitsu, and striking, all this kind of stuff. As the S&C coach, do you feel you get optimal time with all your fighters? Are there any examples during your career where you feel if you have had, gotten more time with the fighter, the results could have been better for them as opposed to what they were?
Yeah. Well, I can only speak from my own personal experiences and my circumstances, but in a lot of ways, due to the high frequency and volume of training, very rarely do I get full access to a fighter throughout the entire camp. I mean, certain aspects of their game must be worked in order to create success for the individual careers. But in a sense, they're doing a lot. So from a physical preparation standpoint, I usually am the last line of defense. If I had my choice, I like to have them at least 3 days a week and manage fatigue while progressing each aspect of physical preparation, but it doesn't always work out that way, as we know. So, yeah, if I had my choice, they'd definitely be with me more often. But again, skill work is definitely important, and it just depends on the fighter. It depends on where their weaknesses lie and what they need to improve upon going into fight camp and throughout fight camp.
Now, if you could guesstimate a percentage, what percentage would you say of time in the overall, scheme of the camp do you get with a particular athlete, compared to everybody else? Is it would you say it's a quarter of the time you get them to do strength and conditioning, less, more? And what would, what compared to what you do get, what would you prefer percentage-wise?
Can you ask the question again? Sorry about that. I got my son here, so I'm trying to keep him quiet.
What would the percentage amount you say you get time-wise with your fighters? I'm sure all of them are going to be, it's going to be distributed between the wrestling and striking and all that stuff. Percentage-wise, how much time do you say you get? And compared to that, what would you really want? Is it 10% you get and you really wish you had 30% of their time during camp, like that?
I'd say I'd have about 20 to 30% of their time, depending on the fighter and where they're at in camp. Mm-hmm. Primarily, more outside of camp, let's say, 10 to 12 weeks out, they're definitely with me, maybe 60% of the time. Once it gets closer into the fight, then we start to diminish that and they start working more on their skill work, because at that point, we build a pretty solid base of strength and a base of fitness. And then from there, it's kind of just getting their conditioning down, making sure that they are peaking at the right times. So it does depend on, the fight programming or the date and how many weeks they are out. And then that depends on how long, I get to see them. Sometimes I'll see a fighter once a week at points, which I don't necessarily agree on. But if that's the case, if they have to do that to get all the other training in, that's more important at that time, then, I have to make that happen. I have to let it be and go from there. So I would say 8 weeks out, I have them for a good 50%. And then as the weeks go by, it kind of decreases a little bit from 50 to 30% all the way up until about 2 weeks out. And then they're pretty much done with me from there. I mean, all of our work is pretty much over with. Now it's just kind of fine tuning things and working on mobility and keeping their aerobic capacity up, which they won't lose anyway. So, he goes from there.
Cool. Now I would like to welcome on our guest. He is a man with a diverse set of skills. He's an adjunct professor at Long Island University and has a master's in both sports science and nutrition, which is extremely impressive. But not only does he have talents in academia, he's a strength and conditioning coach for many mixed martial arts fighters, one of them including former UFC middleweight champion Chris Weidman. Yet that is not all. He is also a black belt in several martial arts disciplines. Unbelievable. And maybe the best part, at least for me, of all of this stuff, is that he's also he's a current New Yorker, baby. Tony Ricci. Tony, thank you so much for coming on the show this morning.
That's a nice intro, Jason. Thanks. And to you and Phil, I'm really happy to be here. You guys, I just started following up on your shows, and because I've been traveling much and caught up, and you're doing wonderful work. So for me, I really thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you.
Now, from all of your knowledge that you've had and that you acquired, tell the people a little bit about yourself and how you got started in the industry and what led you to work with fighters such as Chris Weidman.
Okay. So, what happened, Phil, is many years, I'm 52 years of age, so I've been around a little bit and grew up. My dad, being born in Italy, came over off the boat and was a tremendous boxing fan. And I had the fortune of growing up in a wonderful boxing era. I actually saw, Ali Frazier fights on TV. Hagler Hearns, just the best. I grew up in a wonderful generation of boxing, so was always a fight fan. And then later in life, during college, practiced a host of different martial art disciplines, judo, a lot of jiu-jitsu, and even some wrestling. So throughout the years, I always loved fighting. And as I went through academia, I became even more fascinated with fight physiology. And it became, clear to me that fighting was different, very, very different than basketball, than so much football, than baseball, and that they had tremendous differences in the bioenergetic requirements, the performance requirements.
Sure.
And I became fascinated with fight physiology. So while going through school and, learning exercise physiology, learning strength and conditioning, learning nutrition, I'm going, wow, these sports that I've loved my entire life, these sports that I've followed my entire life, really, really are unique in that the demands are tremendous. Absolutely tremendous. The physiological demands, the mental demands, and they're unique. They're different than football. They're different than baseball. They have different work to rest requirements. They have different physiological demands. So really what happened was an amalgamation of me going through school, loving boxing, training, rolling, throwing people, getting thrown, and going, wow, man, this is cool. So by mid-90s, I found myself invested only in fight performance and hanging around in fight gyms with boxing coaches, MMA coaches, and falling in love with it.
Nice. Yeah, so I mean, let's dive into it a little bit. How do you feel about that current situation on weight cutting? And can you take us through the process for helping your fighters make a weight?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's obfuscated. I think we're making some progress, Jason, Phil, on the California State Athletic Commission, as you guys know, proposed a 10-point plan that may not be perfect, but it has some good features in it. The key things that I find are this. First, we got to take an in-depth background, because if you're going to have any success with your fighter, if you don't have an in-depth history of their weight cutting practices, it's going to be difficult to know where they stand. I mean, there's a big difference between somebody who wants to enter MMA and has had a kickboxing background and a boxing background in weight cut throughout their entire career, and somebody who's been wrestling since they're 8. And so first thing is we got to gather data. What is their weight cutting history? If somebody if they've been a wrestler for 10 years and they're 21 years of age, they've had an extensive weight cutting history. And not only a weight cutting history where they're fighting 4 times a year, a weight cutting history in which 7 to 8 months a year they're trying to make weight. So a couple of things happen there. The approach to how they make weight may differ from the boxer, for example, or the kickboxer. Okay. And the duration in which they've been doing it differs. So the first thing I really need to have, guys, is historical context, because that's going to impact how they cut weight and, to be honest with you, their capacity to cut weight. Because even a young athlete that's been cutting weight for 10 years may have an adaptive thermogenic effect in which, boy, they're going to struggle in their future weight cuts, if you will. So the key thing is that history, and then the primary variables. Okay. What is their weight now? What is their percentage of body fat? Are they hydrated? What is their target goal? What do they have to hit? And how are we going to get there? So the primary thing I try to do is take the arbitrary nature of weight cutting out. And what I mean by that is you got somebody who's like 210 and they're like, well, I'm going to make 185. All right, but how are you getting there? It seems like they have no idea. They just strip things off, and they strip off too much of what they do need and don't get rid of what they should, and just jump on a scale. So the most important thing for me is really to look at body fat levels, lean muscle tissue levels, body fat water, total body water, forgive me, well in advance, and start and try to make a decent prognostication as to how we're going to make weight.
No, that makes sense.
Now, when I was, looking up and researching information on you, I saw several places it mentioned you having a background in martial arts, a black belt. Could you, give more background, like how you got into martial arts, what particular disciplines you worked into?
Yeah, I like the throwing arts. So a lot of sambo, a lot of judo and jiu-jitsu in many years down in Texas. And I did those because, I boxed a little bit when I was young at the local athletic leagues here, maybe I was like 13 years old, 14 years old. And even at that age, anybody who weighed what I weighed was 1.5 feet taller than I was. So I learned really fast that, okay, this isn't going to work. I'm not stepping into jabs my entire life, and I'm going to get pounded. And, this very guy was beating the hell out of me. I think I can throw him on his head. So therefore I kind of moved outside of that and said, I think I'm going to be better at this throwing stuff. And most of that started, it wasn't interscholastic because my family had a commercial fishing business and I was forced to work my entire life, really. I didn't do a lot of scholastic sports. So I was doing all of those arts, guys, on my own outside of outside of wrestling and in high school and football and those type of things, because I worked every weekend and nearly 2 or 3 weekdays. So I had to go on my own to enjoy those types of practices.
Now, to follow up on your previous knowledge, I've talked with Phil about how his background in having fought MMA does help the trust factor some when he's training fighters. Do you feel because you have a background in martial arts, you've done all these things, you practiced in it, and you have an understanding of the working that goes into the arts and the sport of MMA, that the fighters you train also trust you maybe quicker and it helps the process, as opposed to a strength and conditioning coach with a background in a different sport like football?
Jason, I do. And I think, and I watch Phil and this is not because I'm on your show, Phil, but your skill set is so diverse and you've done a wonderful job, and having been a part of it and continuing to be a part of it. I mean, I'm an old man. I'm still on the mats.
Yeah, I see that,
hit.
man.
Yeah, I still hit. I still punch. I still have Ray Longo teach me how to, to perfect my uppercut.
Nice.
And I'm still doing those things. And strength and conditioning today, I think, is at a point where we know so much that, when I was a kid, I got my, I think like it was me, Ben Franklin, and a few other people had the certification. And the way it was, like one strength coach would train every sport. Yeah. Well, we're beyond that now. I think there's such specificity, and so I delve myself into fight performance and the actual training, and I think the guys really find that helpful, and they see me on the mat still going and punching and kicking. So I do think that really helps, because knowing the sport and every aspect of it does give you insight onto how to take the very great training principle we have and just kind of refine to the very sport that we're involved in. So I think it is helpful, Jason. I really do.
Yeah, I think that it has a big correlation between what we do as coaches now, because we can relate the certain types of movements that we've learned from a strength and conditioning perspective and put it into the sport itself. Exactly. And the fighters respect us for it, So that is a major thing for this sport in general, because there isn't a lot of people like ourselves that actually been on the mats and actually trained the way these guys trained. But that's awesome, man. I like what you're doing. I still see you doing your thing out there, grappling with the guys and hitting pads and stuff. That's awesome, bro.
I'm trying. You're hanging in there.
Yeah. So let me dive in a little bit more, okay? Because I know weight cutting is a big issue, definitely, and everybody wants to know, and everybody's getting fed wrong information. So I want to go with an expert to really break this down. Now, how important is the rehydration process after weigh-ins? And since the UFC doesn't allow IV use anymore, in your opinion, what is the most effective way to get a fighter back to close to 100%? And obviously, if that's even possible.
Yeah, great question, and I love the way you phrased it, because is that possible? And I think there's a host of factors. One, the obvious: how vicious was the cut, right? And how extreme was the cut? The key thing, I think, here's the obvious. One of the things that what happens is at the professional level, at the elite level, at the guys who wore the belts. I've been blessed to work with in Bellator, McGeary, Galvo, guys, Weidman, obviously, a lot of guys who have had belts in MMA and in boxing. And the good news for them is, hey, they know 3 months, 4 months in advance when their fight is. And that makes the cut easier, which makes the rehi a little bit easier, providing they're doing what they should. Where it becomes really difficult is the guys who are working their way up the scale, right? And all of a sudden they get a call in 3 weeks, in 4 weeks, hey, so-so broke his hand, you want to jump in. Yeah. And those extreme weight cuts become brutal. And their demand on lean muscle tissue loss and fat loss is mitigated. Well, let me take that back. Their lean muscle tissue loss and water loss has to be greater because there's been much less time for fat loss. Under those circumstances, to your point, Phil, it gets much harder to do the rehi, but the rehi is vital. What are we trying to accomplish? Well, you have an athlete that is going to be very glycogen depleted. So the best we can do first is say their liver depending upon the size of the athlete. I wish I had a device that would measure this in specificity. There's a new device called Muscle Sounds that tells you the percentage of glycogen storage that athlete may have, but not the grams. But the first thing I look at is I got to get an estimation in my mind. Okay, here's an athlete that probably holds about 500 grams of muscle glycogen, maybe 100 grams of liver glycogen. They're probably down to 200. What's the first thing I know? I got to get that glycogen back in them. Okay, sure. Vital. If I get the glycogen back in them, that helps to bring and helps to facilitate the intramuscular storage of not only carbohydrate but water. The other thing I've got to do is, what do I need? I need vast amounts of electrolytes.
Yes.
So I try to get the fighters. I eat 6 or 7 colors over and over again throughout the course of the rehy or the meal process. Got to get in magnesium, potassium. So the point to this is even a tough weight cut can be mitigated if we do everything right. And off the scale, immediate fluid, as you know, immediate carbohydrate. And usually I like powders because, we don't want to force heavy digestion. We want to facilitate in the electrolytes, the glycogen. But if we can get water back in every compartment, which I believe we can, which is intracellular, through the right electrolytes, right, and the muscles inside the muscle, through the right electrolytes, through good glycogen intake, interstitially, with the right balance of sodium, potassium, magnesium, get that water in between the cells. The plasma immediately, because you know how dehydrated these athletes are, their blood plasma is down. So really, we talk, Phil, in terms, and Jason, of 3 compartments. We got to put water back in. We got to put it back inside the cell, outside the cell, back in the blood. But there's really a 4th compartment, and that's the brain, because the dehydration of the brain, as you well know, leads to really, really attenuated performance, cognitive processing. So essentially now we got 36 hours in some cases, depending upon a 8 a.m. weigh-in and maybe a 10 p.m. fight, to say 34 hours to say, okay, we can really back up or reverse this tough weight cut with the right foods, the right fluids, the right intake of carbohydrates, protein, the right timing, and we could lessen the damage, if you will, of that cut and try to optimize performance. Either way, it's not easy. It's a tough, short window to get it done, but I really believe it needs to be done. You can't go out and go get a Slurpee and a Big Mac and wow, like some guys are still doing.
No, that.
So anyway, my point to that is it's no great revelation. It needs to be systematic. Know what they need: potassium, sodium, magnesium, carbohydrates. How many grams? They're probably going to need 1,500 to 2,000 grams of carbohydrate intake from the time they get off a scale to the time they go into the fight. How much water? Well, you continue to weigh, right? Get off the scale. All right, here's how many pounds we gained 4 or 5 hours later. What's the urine color? Use a refractometer and say, hey, wow, it looks like we're getting rehydrated here. And those are all some of the things we can do, guys.
I have a question for both of you, because you bring up the water thing. Now, my brain, I always think of when there are people weight cutting, I think of Raging Bull and De Niro's in the sauna sweating, can't have a piece of ice. Like, when you guys are weight cutting with a fighter, how much water are they allowed to even drink or intake or any fluids at all when they're in that very close within an hour of weigh-in? Are they not allowed to eat or drink? Because I see some of them have to do physical exercise to cut more weight, but I would figure you need the energy, the water, or even the food to fuel that. Like, how does that work out, to fuel more weight cuts so close?
Phil, eat it first, and then I'll join in if you want.
Well, I mean, it really just depends on how close they are and weight.
Yeah.
Usually, if a guy is close, I would say, 3 to 5 pounds. I give them a sip or two, maybe even just wash their mouth out. But it really just depends. Like I said, it's all subjective. And at that last minute, and we're talking, you definitely want to make sure that they're not consuming anything else that they're going to put on, especially if they're really close. But I don't necessarily like to put on any added cortisol release into the system, just because, you're already damaging the body in general from cutting the weight. Yeah. So a lot of like heavy exercises, like pad work and things like that, I do like to not, I don't like to do that primarily. baths and things like that, sauna sessions. I'm not too big of a fan. I'd really just like to have them rest as much as possible, get the cortisol down so they can actually disperse that weight as efficient as they can. Tony, do you have anything to say on that one?
No, yeah, really good point on the cortisol, Phil, and you're right. And Jason, you brought up a point. So to an extent, a passive weight cut, if possible. And Phil's point is well taken too on the baths and the sauna. However, if given the option and they have to pull that water out, to Phil's point, I'd rather do that than sit there and kick Tide pads for 3 hours, because if I can spare glycogen, if I can relax my nervous system, if I, that's imperative. I don't want to keep taxing the body right up to the scale, because I'd like to get some rest. So that's a wonderful point. And as far as the water, to your point as well, Jace, here's how I look at it. The capacity to turn water over and pull it is going to be contingent upon the fighter's behavior throughout the camp. So a lot of people like to water load. And I always say, well, water loading is fine, but if you just water load the whole camp, because the more water you drink, the higher the turnover. Yeah, exactly. So what I always look for is, I'm in the fight gyms. I'm like Phil. I'm not in a separate gym. So I get to watch my fighters. I get to weigh them before and after a sparring session. And if they're turning over 4 or 5 pounds per session, that's great, because then I know their fluid intake is sufficient and their water turnover is going to be high. And then when they try to pull that water for their cut, it's going to be easier. But if my fighter's in there and they're working 2 hours and they're dropping 1 pound, the likely case is that their fluid intake is not sufficient and their turnover isn't very high. So how much water that fighter can take in the day before is really contingent upon how effective their turnover is. I'll send these guys in a little bit of a sauna 5 or 6 weeks out just for a half hour, just to find out how much water they're losing. So I can at least get an indication on how effective their turnover is. But if it's not high, if they can't pull water out easily, then they're going to have a hard time. They're going to need the baths.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good statement. I like the fact that you stated that these guys need to be adequately hydrated throughout the entire camp. They're athletes. They're high-level athletes. They're professionals. And even if you're not, you're an amateur, you need to practice like a professional. And definitely, water intake is a big deal, man. And what's always said, the more water you put in, the less water you actually hold. So great insight.
Exactly.
As always, Tony. Now, in camp, what's your approach on periodization, and how does the nutrition alter that throughout the different times in camp?
Well, that's a wonderful question, because they're so intertwined. And I think Phil, a lot of times and I don't try to be a control freak, because I'm not saying I know everything. I just try to learn a little bit about, because everything's connected. Regarding setting up a periodization model, right? The first thing in order to set up a periodization model is I got to get the fighter's schedule, because I need to know their training sessions. How many times per day? 3 sessions a day. Jits here. Striking pads here on Monday. And then I got to try to first take the models that we know. I take the strength training protocols we know and somehow systematically fit them into a radically difficult training schedule to begin with. So the first thing I will do before putting even a periodization model together is try to. And I say try because, boy, you know this, Phil, they're all mapped. Get their entire 8-week training schedule, when they're doing A, when they're doing B. Now, just quickly with the nutrition tie-in, that's why sometimes it's really difficult. If you got a nutritionist over here, this coach over here, well, the nutritionist doesn't know their training schedule, doesn't watch them, doesn't see how many times a day they're training, doesn't know it, so they may not feed them properly. So I try to put it all together. Regarding the periodization model, sometimes it has to be modified, because, as you know, you get a guy who comes in 6 weeks into the camp and now wants to do all types of training that should have been done at week 12 before the fight.
Exactly. Yep.
So we have this wonderful periodization model where we could do various blocks, and we can do strength, and we can and you break this down well, because I watch you. We can do a strength endurance, strength speed. We can do all the different phases. We can do hypertrophy phase if the fighter needs it. all these various blocks. But the difficulty that we really run into is half the time these guys show up a little bit late and you have to modify it. Then you may be in the middle of a strength phase, a pure strength phase, maybe 10, 12 weeks out. It's a young fighter. They're 21. They don't have a tremendous history of strength training. So you really need that foundational strength. And I'm ready to do some strength work with them. And they come in, and now heel hooked them, and that throws them.
Yep.
So I think flexibility.
Man, just like this is
spot.
crazy.
Am I right? Or do you run into that?
Yeah, definitely.
Just me. So.
Hello?
Go ahead, Jason.
Okay.
Jason?
Yeah. I was reading an interview you did for International Society of Sports Nutrition, and you were explaining all the preparation you do beforehand in regards to your fighters. For example, talking to their coaches and the other disciplines to see what they're looking for, reviewing their past training. However, along with reviewing data and film on the fighters you're training, you also do the same on the opponent. And that fascinated me because I didn't expect that. How much do you delve into a fighter's opponent for a given camp? And furthermore, how much would that piece of the puzzle, does it affect the program, the specific program you have or fighter going into their fight?
Okay, so that's Jason. That's a great question. I do a lot of that, and some people will say to me, "Well, Tony, you're nuts. That's not your job. You don't need to be getting involved in that." But I do, because my job, in my opinion, is to make a better fighter. And if just getting that person in better shape makes them a better fighter because it makes them because of better endurance and conditioning, then I'm happy. However, in my eyes and philosophy, I'm not the head coach, and I may not have been head skill coach. I may not have been with the fighter for, like Ray Longo has been with Chris Weidman for 8-9 years. He knows his tendencies. He knows some of his strengths. He knows some of his weaknesses. So therefore, I always go to the skill coach and say, how can I help? What do you think the individual needs? What should they be doing? And then the reason why I'll watch the opponent's fighting style. I'll watch what biomotor abilities that they tend to be superior in. Endurance is its strength. Therefore, we may need to work on a particular aspect of strength and conditioning and emphasize that. So earlier, Phil asked about, periodization models. Well, they're there, and we have wonderful, wonderful models and central tenets of training that are important, but sometimes we have to pick and choose where the emphasis would be. So if you take a fighter as an example, like Wonder Boy, who's a great fighter, well, one of the best kickboxers around, the obvious is he has not been, well, he is now, but until he made his entry, he hadn't done a lot of static strength work. Moving other human beings, lifting heavy weights because of the fact that he was a stand-up fighter. So my point to all this is I do try to take an aggregate of information. You have guys who can punch a hole through the Hoover Dam, but they can do it once, right?
Yeah.
That's all they can do it. So for me to make them stronger, no matter where we are in the periodization model, is not the priority. Then you have guys who could get in boxing, we'll use it as a more appropriate example, 170 punches a round, but they can't knock over a half-empty milk carton. I don't need to work endurance as much with those guys.
Yes.
We need to go to power. So the aggregation of what the skill coach wants, watching film, just helps me maybe change the program a bit. That's all. Right, Phil? Do you agree, or am I going overboard?
Oh, man. No, I definitely agree. I'm over here smiling like constantly over here. But like you said, communication is key between skills coaches and that need to be addressed as in program. Because, it's the way to do it. Circumstance. So if a fighter needs a certain type of aerobic or needs a certain type of bioenergetic demand or strength increase or something along the lines of that, we got to focus on that primarily to get them better as a fighter, and as an athlete. If we can get them athletically tuned in, then they'll be a better fighter. But definitely makes sense, brother.
Right. Great. Because I don't say this lightly. I mean it seriously. Your lead is something that I go with and follow. So good to know.
Awesome, brother.
Now, followers of MMA will often hear about a fighter never being really 100% going into a fight. The rigors of a training camp can be pretty harsh on the body. How much does a fighter's body being beat up affect your training programs for him or her during a camp? And do you have any specific nightmare stories of injuries really hindering a fighter's program in his camp or her camp?
Yeah, cool question. One guy who's a really good guy, and I've been with him a long time. I can say this, and I mean this. He's a good guy, and that is the All-American, who is a former UFC middleweight champ. And one thing I've always admired about him, guys, he has been banged up bad and never says a word. Mm-hmm. And we've had several fight camps in which he's hobbling on one leg, and I'm not going to get and I mean that. Yeah. And you don't get into too much detail because then the UFC or whatever, of course. But we've went into fights with broken cuboid, fractured rib, and so everybody says, well, your fighter wasn't in great condition, and they weren't in great shape, and I don't blame them for getting on me for it. What can I say? But what they don't know, and Phil understands this greatly because again, he's in the fight gyms. Is what they're training with what the average human being in bed for 3 weeks. And so now I've got an entire training camp in which I can't do plyos. Yes. I can't jump. I got no power movements left. I got to go to unilateral lightly loaded weight because they can't even do a hex bar deadlift because the bilateral pressure is too much on the foot. I'm limited in my core work because rotation or even anti-rotation is impacting their rib. So that's a lot of these limitations are there, and we don't see them. And when you're a part of that, you really learn in all aspects of sports that, I'm pissed off at the Yankees now because they're tanking. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes. Hey, I think I got a fellow Yankee fan more than likely there.
Nope, Met fan, unfortunately. So I don't feel bad. I'm suffering much worse than you are right now.
But behind you got to your point, and a great question, Jay, is that behind the scenes we because the inherent assumption in strength training protocols and periodization models is that they're coming in healthy, and the difference is when you're training Usain Bolt and a sprinter, okay, they get some minor injuries, they do, without running at that velocity, but they're not being punched, they're not being kicked, they're not being twisted, and they're not landing on their head. And that we have to approach our sport and our performance training. It really does.
Yeah, every day we have to go around injuries from contact injuries, and my approach and Tony's approach, I'm sure, is to minimize, if not totally just deduct non-contact injuries. So if we can get them stronger, give them a base, and work around these injuries to help them actually get in the cage and fight, then that's a plus on our side. But in the same sense, we still have to work around injuries, still have to be, fundamentally sound in what we do and make sure that we are still progressing each individual without hurting them more. It's the same thing, man. I had to go through this with Mo when he fought Rampage. People are saying, oh, it was a boring fight, this and that. But if people knew exactly what King Mo had to go through, you know what I mean? Like he's good now, he's got his hip fixed and everything is working a little bit better. But we couldn't even run. We couldn't even push a prowler. Wow. We couldn't do any type of plyos. You know what I mean? So there was very limited action going into that fight, and he still worked and did his thing. And so that makes a lot of sense, because what you're saying, I go through on a daily basis, and that's why I have you on my show, brother.
Yeah. No, I know you do. And just a quick note, not to interrupt, but one thing I see you doing, and I wish I had more time, and which is wonderful, is putting so much emphasis on the corrective side, Phil, and you know, and certainly just trying to make sure we got a good a balanced musculoskeletal system. You're doing really good work on that. That can be a missing piece sometimes. Sometimes it's not intentional with me. I just don't have the time to put as much work into that as I want to, because I barely have the time to get the guy through basic biomotor conditioning abilities, you know.
I hear you.
But it's really cool to see how much effort you're putting into that too.
Man, it's much appreciated. Coming from you, that means a lot. Thank you.
You're doing well with it, man.
All right, so let's get into it. What's your top 5 favorite exercises to improve athletic performance? Now, I know this is a small number, but just give me 5 of them, just for the listener's sake.
Okay, so I guess we'll integrate lifts with maybe you know the movement, and I'll keep it specific to MMA. I think the hex bar dead is a good foundational strength movement, and the reason why is it's hard for many people to believe. I love the movement, but you know, you got these world-class fighters, and everybody assumes they're incredibly gifted athletes, and I've got a couple of guys that I get nervous when they cross the street by themselves. Okay?
It's so true, man. It is so true.
Phil, am I right? I mean,
yeah, man.
I got one world champion kickboxer who can't jump rope.
Wow.
Okay? And he's a world champ, and he can't hold the rope right. Never mind jumping over it. So my point is, you know, that hex bar dead is just simple. It is succinct. I don't have to spend 4 weeks teaching a fighter how to do the deads that Phil does in competition, you know, and I keep watching Phil working on his form. I'm like, well, it looks perfect to me. And he's still saying it's no good. Okay. I don't have time to do that with a fighter. So from a strength perspective, I really like that hex bar deadlift and any movement that grossly strengthens the posterior chain. I think a movement I don't see much anymore, as much as a primary strength, is the barbell. Use it a lot, particularly for those in specifically grappling sports. So from a strength perspective, I really love hex bar dead. I really love the barbell rowing, but rowing movements in which the fighter, whether it be they could be in a 90-degree hip flexion, as long as they're supporting the torso and keeping the core neutral. I want that. I don't want bench support on anything. I want that fighter there using the entire body to support. So I like a hex. I like a barbell row. And then certainly on the plyo side, the basics are really good. I love, and you do a lot of this, anything on the lateral movement side, in particular in fighting, because you know, we're fighting in a phone booth essentially once we get close, and we need short, quick movements. So hurdles, laterals, speed skater type movements, wonderful. Love them. Nice. I saw you had, I don't know if it was Dustin the other day, but doing some nice work with the banana bar and those and the lateral single leg hurdles. Love that for the fighter. Love all those unilateral side to side movements. So you can categorize those as the third. The vertical jump, still really great, right? Of course, basic jumping mechanics. And after that, I mean, that's a good 4 spot. So I would go into anything. You know, my plyos are really my favorite thing, because manipulating one's body movement and body weight is the key. Sure. So any host of plyometric movement that is short, quick, diagonal, lateral, and linear explosive, and within, by the way, a 3 to 4 foot parameter, right? Because that's where our fight occurred.
Now with your speed and agility work as well.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Now you have a master's in nutrition. You know, we talked about a little earlier. Now on the show we talk about a lot about weightlifting and programs, circuits, those kind of things, but we don't delve into the food aspect of building up a fighter correctly in camp too much. For young athletes and strength and conditioning coaches that are listening, can you explain or talk about how a mediocre eating habits can derail a good training camp? Because you even mentioned earlier people eating hamburgers and milkshakes. And could you explain how a proper diet goes hand in hand with an athlete to max out their potential heading into fight night?
Yes. Okay, good. So I'm going to give you one quick example. I'll use the aforementioned fighter. One time I didn't do their rehab protocol, and we're going to talk about it in macros, but we had a training camp, and the idea how important nutrition is, fluids are in rehydration. The fighter went in my opinion, about 10 pounds underweight, and the point to that is that when food, water, nutrients are so important that before we said somebody could have a hard weight cut and a good rehab can derail it, can make it better. Well, you can have a great camp, and a bad rehab can derail the whole camp.
Yes.
So it shows you the importance of food and water. And I would just say this, Jason, is that the fighter is really hampering their full capacity if they're not following decent diet. In all, here's the bottom line. Other than oxygen, you're not getting energy anywhere else. The food is the most direct way to change the human body. And the other thing is this. The metabolic demands of the fighter are so great that, we think, okay, we're going to improve. I trained hard. I jumped. I did jits. I hit mitts. I did strength training. Your body doesn't give a flying about you fighting for $500,000 in front of 10 million people. It first cares about metabolic processes that are vital, right? Bone, skin, hair, the immune system, hemoglobin, all the minimum requirements for you to sustain life. In order for your body to say, "Ooh, I'm going to enhance performance," you better believe there needs to be an abundance of nutrients there.
Yes.
There has to be an abundance of protein, carbohydrate, electrolytes, because your body has other priorities. It doesn't care if you can jump from here, New York to Nevada. It's got other issues. So the point to this is a fighter is going to need a minimal amount of protein, carbs, and vitamins and minerals. And Phil and I can make sure that the fighter is getting that minimal through some dietary recommendations. And I tell my fighters, look, I don't care if 12 weeks away from a fight, you don't have an announced fight, you want to have some ice cream or pizza. I'm okay with that. But the problem is that should not is what you need. You need a minimum amount of protein, carbs, vegetables in order to recover. And if you don't get that minimum, it's an aggregate effect. Every time you miss a meal that would have helped induce greater recovery and performance, you're limiting that performance residually. So if you could have been 100%, you didn't eat good for 9 weeks, even your new 100% might be 80% of what you could have been. I can't put enough emphasis on nutrition. There is no other way to make a new you. Everything you do in that gym, everything you do is only going to be on and how much you sleep, by the way. If you don't do those two things, you can throw everything else out the window.
Oh, yeah, man. All right. Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate everything you dropped on us. It's I know your time's limited, so I do definitely want to thank you for dropping those knowledge bombs. Obviously, it's going to be much appreciated for the listeners. And I want to thank you again, brother.
Well, gentlemen, I'm really happy to be here. And Phil, I'm becoming what I say is a front office guy, right? The old timers they don't coach as much anymore, and you send them up to the front office. You're on the field, my man. And when I watch you, I'm like, you know what? Strength and conditioning has a real damn good future, because this guy is doing ball. And so I'm going to hit the front office soon and manage from afar and just watch you, my friend. And I thank both of you guys, because this is really cool to be here with you. And I hope some of what we shared would, at the very least, just, helps to if nothing else, ask more good questions for all of us. So thanks, gentlemen.
No
Tony,
problem.
is there any social media you like to plug? Like, do you have, you have the Facebook? Do you have a Twitter? Maybe a page? I know the Fight Shape International, and anything you'd like to let people know so they can follow you and continue to get your outstanding knowledge on this particular industry?
Well, thanks, Jason. I tend to fly under the radar. I concede I'm really shy about all this and promotion. I don't know. I'm not very good at it. It seems like all my Instagram followers are girls in bikinis from some obscure country.
That's bad.
well, it's only that one day I have 2,100, and then Instagram went in, and I wake up the next day and it's 1,300. So obviously we're legit. But I don't seem to get any real. But anyway, I like Instagram. It's just easy. I don't have a lot of followers there, but _Ricci, and if anybody wants to join me there, I share ideas with Phil and run things by him on Instagram, and that would be wonderful. So
Listen,
I would thank anybody who comes on in and joins me there.
Yeah, man. Listen, all the listeners here, if you do not follow this man, trust me, you will. If you don't follow him, you're gonna regret it. So go ahead and do it right now. I'm telling you right now.
Phil, thank you, Jason. Appreciate it, gentlemen.
I thank you for coming. I appreciate it so much. It was awesome.
All right. Talk soon, guys. Take care.
All right.
All right.
All right. Well, that was Tony Ricci. That is our episode for today. I am Jason Burgos. He's Phil Daru. Phil, say bye-bye.
Peace.